They were buying public support with a combination of flattery for the Alaskan bravado, that we were up for anything. What's a little radiation? You can't even see this stuff. And the lure of federal dollars spent in the state, which we needed, and then the completely dissembling characterizing of the dangers by the AEC. But it's notable that virtually every sector of Alaskan society that had an influence on public opinion bought it. They were behind it 100%. Almost no sector with any political juice was against it. The only opposition came from a group of physical scientists at the University of Alaska, a very small conservation group in Fairbanks, and the native people of Point Hope. And it was a coalition of those three entities that gave the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission its first defeat ever.
Hello, and welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today I'm speaking with Dan O'Neill, author of the book, The Firecracker Boys. This book tells the story of a U.S. Atomic Energy Commission project to blast a harbor in Alaska called Project Chariot and the people who prevented it from taking place. That may sound like a pretty ordinary story, except it wasn't an ordinary blast. These were not ordinary times, and the government was certainly not dealing with ordinary people. This blast was part of a much bigger AEC plan called Plowshare. The name derives from a Bible passage about beating swords into plowshares as nations turn away from warfare. This project lasted over 20 years, searching for civilian uses of nuclear weapons. I think it's best just to let the AEC explain their vision for nuclear excavation and where they see its uses.
Where present land travel is awkward, costly, time-consuming, and dangerous, excavating mountain passes for highways and railroads. Where water navigation is thwarted by imposing barriers of earth, excavating canals. Where commerce is stifled by forbidding shorelines, excavating harbors. For the diversion of water, cutting channels of great width and depth to carry water to areas of need. Nuclear excavation also presents great potential for industry. For example, in the quick and economic removal of earth overlying deeply buried mineral deposits.
To be fair, the U.S. was not the only one searching for peaceful uses of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had an equivalent program with a more straightforward name. They used, quote, peaceful nuclear explosions for the national economy, end quote. Their program also lasted over 20 years, but extended from just excavation and oil and gas recovery to other projects such as actually building a reservoir. Although not part of a civilian program, India claimed its first nuclear test, Smiling Buddha, in 1974 was a peaceful nuclear explosion. Project Chariot is an amazing story which impacted multiple sectors of society, and I was only made aware of it about a year ago. So I sat down with Dan to ask him what made it so special, why more people don't know about it, and what is the legacy of Chariot. I'm really excited to talk to you about Project Chariot, and not only the impact it had on Alaska, but the modern environmental movement. But before we can talk about Chariot in particular, could you tell us a bit more about the larger project from the Atomic Energy Commission called Operation Plowshare?
Yes. Plowshare, and sometimes called Project Plowshare, was advanced by the Livermore Laboratory, the then called Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Livermore, California, a laboratory operated by the Atomic Energy Commission. And they are weapons designers, bomb designers, nuclear bomb designers. And around, I think it was 1958, they came up with an idea to use nuclear explosions for peacetime uses. So the metaphor was beating the nuclear sword into a peacetime plowshare. And it was promoted most vigorously by Edward Teller, who at one point in this period was director of the laboratory. And he was very enthusiastic to begin to promote really what amounted to civic works, excavation projects, the constructions of harbors and canals and mountain passes with the use of nuclear explosions. And so a lot of people ask, why? What was that all about? And I think the nominal reason was that, well, here we have this tool that has a potential to do in an instant that which takes ordinary tools and man's labor a much longer time to accomplish, and that they were just offering this technology to the wider world. So that was the sort of nominal purpose. But underlying that, I think, was a public relations objective, which was basically to redeem the bomb, to take a technology that had been so destructive and had taken the lives of so many tens of thousands of people, to redeem it in a way that showed it had a beneficial use for mankind. And that would, of course, have legitimated at least somewhat the whole enterprise of creating nuclear bombs and releasing them into human history. So that was an underlying purpose. But I think the most accurate reason as to why they did it was to avoid the provisions of any test ban treaty that might emerge. Test ban treaties were being talked about. They would have thwarted Teller and the laboratory and the Atomic Energy Commission's objective to refine nuclear weapons. If they could get a waiver for so-called peaceful uses of nuclear explosions, they could, in fact, continue to test weapons designs just under the rubric of peaceful use. So I think that was the primary motivator for Teller and the Atomic Energy Commission when they unveiled Plowshare.
It's a very interesting timing when they announced Project Plowshare in 1958. The US, Britain, and Soviet Union actually have this self-initiated moratorium on nuclear testing in October of 1958, which lasts for 3 years. This Plowshare is a way to slip in under the radar of saying we're using this for peaceful uses, not for testing our weapons. It really was an ingenious way of trying to thwart that moratorium.
Yeah, and I think, at least I argue in my book, and I haven't heard anybody shoot it down yet, the idea that this was kind of Teller's MO throughout his career. There were a number of instances where testing might have been restricted, and he rose with a new technology that, if only we could continue to pursue, was going to lead to a great revolution, great discoveries, and much benefit to mankind. So we saw him do it when the nuclear freeze movement started to get a little traction. He came up with the clean bomb. He was going to be able to make a bomb that didn't release radioactivity in any worrisome amounts. And this wonderful development could make the world safer, from collateral damage in the event we had to use a nuclear weapon, and so on. And then, of course, there was his Star Wars and his ideas of using some weapon systems that involve nuclear explosions to create a defensive shield, not an aggressive offensive weapon, but a defensive shield. And, tens of billions of dollars later, no such technology emerged. Plowshare was in that vein, I think. He repeatedly convinced people to keep the laboratory open, keep the laboratories testing. Great things are going to come. So in each case, I think the objective of the arms control proponents was thwarted and the objective of the weaponeer was advanced.
Project Chariot was the first project that was announced under Operation Plowshare. What was the goal and why was Alaska chosen?
There's levels of meaning, levels of answer.
What was the surface reason like?
Yeah, the nominal reason was to offer Alaska, which was in 58, it was just becoming a state. And it was a very underdeveloped state. It still are really. It's still not really well developed, which a lot of us think is a very good thing. But anyway, there was also a great push with statehood to bring federal dollars in to provide infrastructure, airports, harbors, roads, and so on. And so in Alaska, it's a very popular thing to find the federal funding and find jobs for people and so on. And so Teller was coming up offering, in this context, a free public works project worth probably millions of dollars, even in 1958 there. And that was to create this harbor by burying and detonating a string of nuclear bombs. And the first configuration had, I think it was 4 little bombs and 2 big ones, the little bombs, and all in a chain, so that when they blew off at once, it would create a rose-shaped crater, kind of keyhole-shaped, with the little bombs carving an entrance channel and the 2 big bombs carving a turning basin where you could easily make a U-turn with an aircraft carrier.
What was little, though? When you say little, we're talking nuclear weapons. So what's a little nuclear weapon?
The configuration changed repeatedly over time. I don't have them all in my head anymore, but I think the little ones were 60 kiloton. So that's on the order of 3 or 4 Hiroshimas each, times 4. And the 2 big ones at a megaton each. That's 1 million tons of TNT equivalent. So 2.4 megaton total. And so that would have been, there must have been 100 KT originally for the 4 little ones. That's the 0.4. In any case, I once calculated what would a convoy of trucks carrying conventional dynamite look like if it had 2.4 megatons on board. So a string of 1-ton trucks, literally bumper to bumper, carrying that much dynamite would stretch from Fairbanks, Alaska to southern Argentina. So an enormous wallop, 40% of all the firepower expended in World War II, touched off in an instant with the 70 million cubic yards of earth pulverized, irradiated, and shot as high as the stratosphere, thence to circle the globe and fall out where it might. Most of it, of course, would not have gone that far and would have settled on the adjacent lands, which were used by the native people in their subsistence activities. That was the nominal objective of Chariot, to create this instant harbor up where along a coast where there wasn't any good harbors. And Teller advertised it as something that would open up coal mining and fishing, safe haven for fishermen to exploit commercial fish stocks. Truth was, there were no commercial fish stocks that high up in the Chukchi Sea there. And so that was really not a possibility. And the other thing was that the coal deposits Teller seemed to be alluding to were on the other side of the Brooks Range, which would have required a very long railroad to bring to port. And the construction of a railroad on the permafrost soils of the Arctic tundra is no small thing. I mean, period. It would have nixed any such project. And then finally, the port he was going to create would freeze solid 9 months of the year. So if you were to bring coal to the harbor, you'd have to have warehouses to store it in until the season opened up. In other words, it made no economic sense, and virtually everybody could see through it. Not to say the Alaskan boosters didn't want it just the same, because it was federal money spent in the state. While that was the nominal purpose, a more likely explanation has to do with good public relations, in that they would be offering this technology and could showcase it to other potential clients. And moreover, I think there was a testing component to this project, so that while the AEC expressed complete confidence in their knowledge of nuclear explosion phenomenology, they did not have that. And furthermore, they certainly didn't have it in Arctic soils, permanently frozen soils. And finally, how easily could you extrapolate cratering physics in permafrost to lower latitude soil structures? Approximately not at all. So that underlying reason had a lot of flaws to it. And I think the other thing, too, was that it would have run into a lot of trouble with the Soviet Union to be blowing up something, the ejecta of which could have very easily landed in the USSR, depending on which way the wind happened to blow that day. So those are some of the stated reasons and underlying reasons and the flaws with each.
Well, I understand why the kind of Alaskan boosters, the politicians, would want to see this project come. And I know times have changed, but as a citizen, I guess I would question why you would make a harbor with a nuclear weapon. Like why I'd be okay with this as an Alaskan citizen in 1958.
Well, the AEC gave blanket assurances that it was impossible for there to be any radiological harm, any seismic harm, any air overpressure harm. All of that was untrue. All of that is impossible. I mean, and it still blows my mind that they could even do a back of the envelope calculation at 2.4 megaton and not see that you would knock over every building in Point Hope 31 miles away and possibly trash them with shockwave 2, air shock. And the radiological consequence, in fact, could have been just astronomical. What they hoped was that they were working on developing a scaling model that wherein the deeper one buried a charge of a given magnitude, more dirt would stay in the hole, basically, that you could eject Earth from that shock wave that would not be quite an atmospheric venting. It wouldn't just, like if we put a firecracker in the sandbox at 1 inch deep, that entire cavity or area around the firecracker will eject out of the hole. But if you put it down, say 6 inches, you still might make a dimple in the surface without actually venting to the atmosphere. So depending on the magnitude of the charge and the depth of burial, you could begin to refine the release of radiation. And so it was these scaling laws that they had done a very little bit of work in Nevada on, and Chariot would have been a great test for them. And it was one of the reasons. But in any case, they were buying public support with a combination of flattery for the Alaskan bravado, that we were up for anything, we were pioneer stock, what's a little radiation, you can't even see this stuff. And the lure of federal dollars spent in the state, which we needed, and then the completely dissembling characterizing of the dangers by the AEC. But it's notable that virtually every sector of Alaskan society that had an influence on public opinion bought it. They were behind it 100%. Almost no sector, well, I guess I would say no sector with any political juice was against it. And that includes church people, university presidents, the legislature, publishers of every newspaper, every single chamber of commerce, name it. They were on board. The only opposition came from a group of physical scientists at the University of Alaska, principally biologists, conservationists, a very small conservation group in Fairbanks, and the native people of Point Hope, not the native people broadly, not the regional assembly of villages, only that one. And it was a coalition of those three entities that gave the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission its first defeat ever. That was pretty amazing. Totally grassroots activism was the core of this opposition.
Now you've introduced the heroes of this story.
Yeah, well, they were arrayed against every powerful sector in Alaskan society, and they were arrayed against a federal agency that had virtually unlimited power and had never been thwarted in any of its activities. So to pull off that victory is quite amazing. And the way it came about was the professors at the university heard Teller and his people from Livermore give their rap and their blanket assurances. Well, they had enough basic information to know you can't make those statements on the basis of the published literature. There is no literature that supports those statements. And so they pushed back. And they may have had some degree of self-serving interest in that their main proposal was that the AEC fund environmental studies to begin to answer those questions, at least by establishing a baseline of the environmental conditions, which might then be measured post-shot to see what actually could be said about the effects of these kind of projects on the environment. So they pushed for these studies, and AEC seemed to think to itself, well, if that's all it takes to eliminate our opposition, we'll fund some studies. Not to say that there weren't some sincere people within the AEC, particularly once that group got established to manage those studies. There were a lot of very principled people involved. And they produced this enormous collection of studies. I'm holding up the book right now.
It's like, what, 3 inches thick?
Yeah. And it is a remarkable document in history, in the history of environmentalism, in that it has studies on climate, engineering, geology, surface water, permafrost, slope stability, vegetation, all the flora, palynology, that's pollen science, freshwater algae, birds, caribou, terrestrial mammals, invertebrates, sea cliff birds, zooplankton, oceanography, marine geology. It goes on and on to include human geography. They had investigators looking at how the people made their living from the land, which was primarily the harvesting of animals. The more the scientists dug into the reality there and familiarized themselves broadly with the environmental consequences of nuclear detonations, the more they saw this as a very problematic enterprise. And this understanding reached the native people of Point Hope, who were significantly independent. They had a long tradition of managing their own affairs. They kind of stood out among the Inupiat people of the Northwest Arc of Alaska as very independent-minded. And early on, when Western structures of self-governance began to come in, like even the church society had its little hierarchy among the people, and then a village council and mayor structure. Earlier than that, it had been whale captains who collectively managed public affairs. When the Western concepts were adopted, they managed them very astutely. They were sort of innately political and smart. So the AEC had no idea that they happened to be picking the one village that would have given them the most trouble. And that was sort of proven when the AEC finally, after some years, visited the villages along the Arctic in the region of the proposed shot. And at every single village, there were no significant questions or objections, except Point Hope, where they ran tape recorders when the guys spoke, and they were opposed virtually unanimously, consistently, and never wavered.
I found that very interesting in your book when you mentioned that the AEC didn't come against much objection in any of the other villages in northwestern Alaska. And so do you think it's this independence of the Point Hope people and the way that they thought about things that was the reason that they thought differently and had more objections than the other villages did, or they didn't trust the government as much? Why did they have so many more objections?
That would be a good question for those folks out there. I mean, I certainly read a lot and thought a lot about it and talked to people about it. My sense was that this particular village was somewhat exceptional among the villages out that way, and that in their prehistoric times, they controlled a large fraction of that area by military force. And so they had a tradition of being leaders and tough-minded and used to handling adversity, you might say. And otherwise, I just don't know. But it is, I mean, we tend to think of the native people as a monolithic block with one idea, but they clearly weren't in this instance. Most people were interested in temporary jobs they might be able to get, but Point Hope's reaction was nothing like that. It was very, very concerned. They could see the potential for harm to their animals. And as I say, their economy was based on animals.
How were animals the basis of their economy? What did they use them for?
To subsist upon, because there's almost nothing that you can grow and preserve there except berries. So the people relied on an annual whale hunt. And if you were to land a 70-ton bowhead whale and had 300 people in your village, but they actually shared among villages. So there was that. And then there were caribou in the hills. And they also hunted other sea mammals, seals, walrus, beluga, the white whale, ducks when they could get them, fish from the rivers. So their seasonal activity revolved around what animals were available when, and their social structure was knit together by this process of harvesting and sharing and preserving and so on. There just wasn't much of another way to make a living in that country pre-airplanes. So here in 1958, there were still people living in sod houses. And these would be a slight excavation of a couple of feet maybe, and then putting upright the arching bones of whale ribs and jaw bones and things. And then to cover all of that with sods, just kind of like bricks. And so there were still people living in those places and burning seal oil for light and heat and living a very subsistence way. Most of them had gotten into frame houses by then, but you could see that they were not far removed from their very ancient ways. And that particular village, too, is thought to be possibly the longest occupied village in North America. A couple thousand years back, people were at that site. So that, too, might have accounted for the sort of entrenched attitudes of people from that place as to being at the pinnacle of their society.
Why didn't the AEC just basically bulldoze these concerns from the native people and the scientists? Because they're the powerful federal government. They could have just gone ahead and done what they wanted to do.
They were, I think, the most powerful entity in the federal government, really. Livermore people told me, administrators told me, you know, we didn't think we answered to AEC Washington. We didn't think we answered to the Congress. We answered to the president. He said, we just go to the top. We had unlimited money and unlimited power, he told me, about his own operation. So I think that's exactly a good question. It's exactly right that why the heck didn't they do? They could have done it, I'm sure. And I think the reason was that they were also, among the ways in which they led society was in the deployment of public relations. This is my theory anyway. And as I look at it, they were just developing techniques to reach deeply into our society in many, many sectors, including children in school and evening programs of lectures for adults, cartoons, movies, speakers' bureaus. And when they came to a place to push an idea, they were there with all the venues of interaction with the public, all the church groups, the newspapers, television, radio, everything. They really were a geared up and well-staffed public relations operation. So now you have Chariot, where the picture is you're going to blow up the ancestral homeland of Eskimo people who have lived there thousands of years in what most U.S. people would consider a primitive way. This doesn't look too good, and the people don't really want it at all. So I think ultimately AEC and Teller could have done what they wanted, but the cost in PR terms became too high. Once the grassroots opposition effort reached the lower states, and you started to have 3, 4, 5, 6 magazines covering this, And that energy growing. And again, church groups outside were writing letters in opposition. Well-connected people in New England who had a slight connection with people at Point Hope had the ear of Kennedy's advisors. They had ways in which they could influence policy that you could hardly imagine coming out of that remote little village. But in aggregate, there was a lot of pressure on the AEC to leave these people alone. And I think it must have been a real hard pill for Teller to swallow, but he did and moved on.
One of the things that the report discusses, and you discuss in your book, is about the caribou. And those who eat them appear to have higher strontium-90 levels than other groups in the world. How did that study come about?
Yeah, many people think this is the principal reason Chariot was canceled. And it kind of just depends on your point of view as to how much the AEC actually cared about this scientific reality. Maybe they cared a lot about it. That would have been, I think, somewhat inconsistent with their history, but it's possible. A number of the University of Alaska scientists, one in particular, William O. Pruitt, was doing studies of caribou and mammals. And in the course of his work, he read scientific papers that came out of Scandinavia and Canada that had to do with the uptake of radioactivity by lichen. Lichen is this little rootless tundra plant, little fuzzy kind of a thing that grows on the surface of rocks and other vegetation. Because it has no roots, it derives its mineral nutrition from airborne dust. So it's built as a spongy little thing to capture airborne dust and extract the minerals it needs to grow. So it was an ideal little organism to catch fallout. In the lower states and in other lower latitudes where they shot off nuclear bombs, but most particularly in Nevada, the fallout would land on grasslands. And the grass has kind of a waxy blade, so it doesn't grab as well as tundra might. And grass is an annual. So every year it died off, and whatever radioactivity was in the blade of the grass was now in the soil. Then the next grass comes up the next spring, and the roots are grabbing mineral nutrition, but there is some discrimination at the root wall for the correct nutrient versus one that is similar but not the same. So it turns out that strontium is a calcium analog, strontium-90, a radioactive substance created in a nuclear explosion, doesn't exist otherwise, and has a half-life of 30-odd years, meaning it really has a potency for centuries, along with cesium-137, ditto for pernicious effect on human health. Well, these elements of fallout in the lower latitudes didn't end up in the next year's blade, so it didn't end up so much in the animals that grazed on it like cattle, and it didn't end up so much in milk and people. Unlike the situation in Nevada, say, up in the Arctic, the fallout was landing on lichen, where it glommed onto it. And lichen was not an annual. In fact, an individual lichen plant could live 70 years. So there they are laying out on the tundra, collecting the fallout of every year's atmospheric testing, year after decade after decade. Now, caribou feed on lichen, and at certain times of the year, it's their favored food. And so you got a caribou now gleaning from acres and acres and acres, all the fallout that's fallen in years and years and years. So it's concentrating into the caribou's body. Then you have man, and the people up there eat a lot of caribou. I mean, I saw a study where on average in one village, each person ate something like 7 or 8 caribou a year. So now you're concentrating that even further into man. So in a lightning quick food chain, radiation from years of fallout was ending up in people's bodies. And the Scandinavians and the Canadians were noticing this and had some papers on it. And Pruitt, the University of Alaska faculty guy, biologist, started to raise hell about it. And it wasn't precisely the purview of his study, and the AEC didn't want him reporting it, but he insisted it go in his report, and he had to fight like hell, and his report was edited over his objection, and ultimately he was fired from the University of Alaska. Undoubtedly, because of his insistence with the AEC that he be able to publish these things and the arguments that developed from that. As well as another faculty member named Les Viereck was also fired from the university for his insistence that these scientific discoveries be reported in that big fat book I showed you. They met only with marginal success as far as the publishing of that stuff, although the book didn't come out till after Chariot was canceled, so there was little for AEC to lose by putting it in then. But he lost his job as well. So that was how the Arctic food web was sufficiently different from the lower latitude food web that it made the problem of a surface burst excavation in the Arctic much more dangerous to animals and people. And it was when these UA scientists started to publish that and started to reach outside, Barry Commoner, who was down at Washington University in St. Louis and running a little group called Nuclear Information, and they had a little publication, heard about it and started to realize that what was going on here was a much bigger issue than just the fallout issue he had been worried about, that the particular environment of the region where the project would happen deeply conditioned the advisability of the project, the potential disaster of such a project. And so he changed the name of his magazine from Nuclear Information to Environment, and it is still a journal today. And he himself shifted his own intellectual and professional focus from plant physiology to environmentalism. And so many people consider that was the moment where Barry Commoner launched the environmental movement. He was certainly one of the key leaders of what would become the environmental movement.
And so you credit this as one of the early successes.
That Chariot resulted in a number of kind of historic firsts. And I do believe, and Commoner told me in an interview, I interviewed him in New York, and he said, to the extent that he had an effect on the development of the environmental movement, which I did, I have to admit, he said, Project Chariot can be regarded as the ancestral birthplace of the environmental movement. So that's a rather astonishing thing to come out of this little grassroots protest in this little tiny Eskimo town way the hell above the Arctic Circle. I think it's true, too. And I think the collection of studies that the AEC agreed to do and finished off publishing after Chariot was dead can be regarded as the first de facto environmental impact statement, which would be required by the National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1969, many years later. So it really did prefigure that milestone in human intellectual history, the idea that you would do a comprehensive study before you did the job to see if you should proceed or not. That was a big step worldwide. Of course, this isn't just U.S. history, but worldwide that became the standard. So Chariot, I think, precipitated that.
The activism by the Alaskan Native people started with Project Chariot, but didn't end there. What were the inhabitants able to accomplish after starting with their activism around Project Chariot?
The struggle of the Native people began to reach audiences in the lower states. And one was the Association on American Indian Affairs, which was a little New York philanthropic group that had several fairly well-heeled members like Henry Forbes and others. And so the association offered the Native people, the Eskimo people at first, legal assistance and money to help organize, to combat Project Chariot. And one of the things they offered was to fund a meeting of all the Inupiaq people in the western and northern Alaska to convene at then called Point Barrow and talk about the issues they faced, which began quickly to revolve around their use of their land and the potential need to own the land in order to continue to do what they'd been doing forever. And so that happened, I think it's 1961 in Barrow. All the native people went up there, Eskimo people. They conducted that meeting themselves in Nuke, by the way, because there's a lot of people who write that the white elitists from New York came up and told the Eskimo people what to do and say and think. But one of the good arguments against that is that their meeting was conducted in Nuke and nobody else understood what was going on. They managed their own affairs. In my opinion, they had their own sources of information as well. Some of them had been in World War II. Some had participated in the cleanup of Nagasaki. All the magazines in the country were putting out articles on nuclear matters, including the testing in the Pacific that had harmed the Marshallese people there. So they knew these things, and they began to see that indeed they were going to have to press for settlement of their land claims, and that to get there, they could really use a newspaper. And so Forbes put up the money, and Tundra Times was born. And around that organ coalesced the political organization of the native people, not just Eskimos, but Athabascans and Aleuts and Tlingit and Tsimshian from all around the state. And the upshot of that was the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which gave multiple times more land to Alaska Natives than had ever been conveyed to all the tribes in the lower states, and millions of more dollars as well. And while generally judged a very imperfect long-term solution, was nonetheless an enormous political accomplishment that the Native people, I think, initiated with that meeting, that newspaper, and the resulting political organization.
Project Chariot was abandoned in 1962. Was it because of the political pressure then?
Yeah, I think the ultimate reason, this is just my own speculation, is that the PR cost was too high. And time also was dragging on. This protest is now in its fourth year, and they wanted to move ahead. So in Nevada, they could do whatever they wanted. So they put together a test called SEDAN, SEDAN. It's all the plowshare shots in that era had names of conveyances. So Chariot, sedan, like a sedan chair. This was a 100 KT shot in Nevada, one of these scaled depth bursts, which shot out all of this enormous quantity of dirt, irradiated and scattered, across the state line in St. George, Utah. They had to put the streetlights on in the middle of the day because of all the dense radioactive dust falling on their town. Amazing. That explosion was designed to answer some of the questions the Chariot explosion would have. And so now the AEC got that information. And it also served as a pretext to say the Chariot was no longer needed, so that the AEC said the Chariot shot would be held in abeyance. They didn't want to say it was canceled. They didn't want to give the victory to the grassroots protesters. And they didn't want that to be the storyline. And so even when I was writing my book in the 80s and early 90s, the AEC could not confirm that Chariot was ever canceled. But it's pretty obvious what they were up to.
Obeying it for that reason, doesn't that just prove that the whole point of Project Chariot was to test a shot and not to build a harbor?
Well, they would have said it was one reason that made us want Chariot less. That among the things Chariot would have done was this scaling information. Now that's off the table. So now we only have the marvelous harbor that we could leave the people and a demonstration project for the rest of the world to see a wonderful harbor, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, but the people don't want that beautiful harbor. So, we'll take our toys and go home.
Yeah, that did go away. There was never an acceptance by the Point Hope people. There's a need for a harbor in that region, but, closer to Nome would make sense because Bering Sea at Nome is very shallow and ships can't come to the town. They have to anchor offshore and everything is lightered in at a lot of effort and expense.
But how far away is Nome from Point Hope?
Oh, a couple 100 miles.
That's so significantly far away.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not in Alaska terms, but even
it is because you couldn't build a road between them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, there's no roads in this region at all. They are not road connected.
Oh, I want to move to the aftermath of Chariot. It surprised me that there were environmental studies done on test holes in 2010. How far did the Chariot site get?
Well, this is a hell of a story, really. But in the course of my work, I found that the Atomic Energy Commission had flown to the Chariot site some of the ejecta of the Sedan shot. So it would amounted to maybe a couple of shopping bags full for volume of irradiated dirt shot out of the Sedan hole. And it was brought up by the U.S. Geological Survey to do an experiment. And this was in 1962, and Chariot was known to be dead already, internally at least. And the idea was to sprinkle some of this radioactive dirt on some of the tundra plants in defined plots bordered by lumber and visqueen polyethylene sheeting. And then with a generator, a pump, and a hose, pull some water out of the creek and hose it onto the tundra plants within this enclosure. And there were maybe 10 of them. And they collect that radiation in a little bottle out of a notch at the lower end, and then take it to the lab and see. Once you knew how much radiation you put on it, you could see how much came off it. So part of this was to show if the Chariot shot had taken place, where would the radiation end up? Would it bind with vegetation on the surface? Would it end up in the soil? Would it flow off with surface runoff? And there were different ways they would measure each of these things. So from my point of view, that's a really good experiment as far as we've gone, because it has the potential to tell you ahead of time, if it's going to move via surface, then mightn't it eventually be blown? It's ferociously windy up there, blown as dust and collect even in drifts. Or if you shot it in the winter, could that be blown into drifts in the village even? But in any case, this had to do with, while it was Nevada dirt, the complex of Nevada soils, not Chariot soil, it was at least on Alaska plants, the correct plants and soil there. So they could get some idea of to what extent this radiation might concentrate in ways that could hurt animals or people. So I shake my head as to why wasn't that scheduled before 1962? It's not part of that big program of studies. And I think that's because it had the potential to say, this is a bad idea. And it was only permitted to go forward when they knew they weren't going to go forward, because then it didn't matter what the answer was so much. Well, in any case, I said it was a good idea up to that point. But then when they screwed up, they collected all this now radioactive plant and soil material, and they scraped it all into a big heap with a bulldozer, and then dozed about 4 feet of clean dirt over the top of that. And then they walked away. And it violated all their regulations for the disposal of radioactive stuff. It was out of spec by 1,000 times. But as I investigated it with people trained in nuclear physics, they told me it shouldn't be. The quantities are small enough. It's 30 miles from the nearest house. It's under 4 feet of dirt. It's now 30 years later because I found this information. But I knew that if I reported it could touch off a big hullabaloo. And I sat on it. And I thought, I'll put it in my book at the appropriate time with the appropriate context. But then I started thinking, yeah, but there it is sitting out there. And probably a native person had filed for a native allotment, as we call them, where he can get title to that land. And someone had. And furthermore, with the laws as screwy as they were, that guy could all of a sudden be liable for a cleanup for stuff he didn't put there. Plus, could there be any health hazard maybe if he started to bulldoze it for some reason? Or people search in mounds for artifacts out there because they may represent an old midden. So there was that. So for a number of reasons, I thought, I can't sit on this information. I have to tell the people at Boring Hope. And while I'm at it, I'll tell the military toxics group that keeps track of where the military has dumped stuff in Alaska, which is approximately everywhere. And so I did, with all the appropriate qualifications, that I don't think this is any kind of health hazard. at all. And that's what I've been told by people who know these things, and I believe them, people I trust. So it'd really be best to just be advised, but don't go running to the newspapers with it. So the guy from Point Hope ran to the newspapers with it. And I got a call from the reporter of the state's biggest paper, and I tried my very best to get him not to write a story about this because I knew it would just take off in a really bad way. He did anyway, top of page one, Sunday, banner headline. And the whole thrust of the story and its iterations from New York Times to LA Times to Tokyo Times around the world was ancient people sitting atop nuclear waste dump, which was not the case. And it was had the potential to alarm, particularly the old people, so much that I thought it was atrocious. Well, it had exactly that effect. And the fellow who released it has become a crusader in this regard. By and large, he is completely wrong about almost everything he says. And the things he claims cannot have happened. And he has stirred up so much anguish and fear and sadness in that village. I just can't believe it.
Looking back, what lessons that we learned during Project Chariot do you think that we can apply today?
It said kind of just almost a direct answer to your question. The lesson Chariot offers is that a free society must be a skeptical one.
In response to my own question, I quote from a chapter Dan wrote in the book titled The Atomic West. On the surface, Project Chariot is a tale of conflict, even scandal, involving passionate, radical, pioneering people. But it is more than that. Chariot illustrates why the most cherished institutions of a free society, a democratic government, a free press, the university, even the church, cannot necessarily be accepted as seats of objectivity and candor. The lesson Chariot offers is that a free society must be a skeptical one, that rigorous questioning and dissent protect, rather than subvert, our freedoms. Thank you for listening. You can find a full list of resources used for this episode on our website, mynuclearlife.com. There you can also find our email and social media information. We would appreciate it if you rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. A special thanks to Dan for taking time to talk to me, and Lexi Weghorn for all of her help on this podcast. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time when we discuss another way nuclear science has impacted your life and the world around you. I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.